Welcome back to the Christ in Culture. This is Gordon.
And this is Clint.
And this is my first time on the podcast.
Ever.
That's
not true. You've been around for like 2 years, dude.
I know.
And this is your first time on the podcast as a
two people.
Married man. We still need to figure that out. I don't think that's... You know what? Say what you want. I'm done.
Two souls. One body.
Yeah. So Gordon's married. That was fun. Like, your wedding was absolutely awesome. It was good stuff. Lots of dancing. I can't believe... I don't know if you ever figured this out, but at the reception, the bad lip reading.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know who?
I do. We were actually right next to her when that was requested, when it got played.
Wait, her?
Yeah. There's a bunch of people that claimed they requested that, but...
Okay, dang it.
I know who actually requested it.
Who was it?
It was Hawk's girlfriend.
Well, now I feel stupid.
Yeah, I heard afterwards, Lizzie's like, 3 people claimed that was theirs.
Yeah. What if there really were like 5 people that requested it?
Well, I saw all the RSVPs. So unless someone actually requested that at that night, which I find highly unlikely.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's pretty random. So to clarify what we're talking about here, at the reception, Gordon and Lizzie made it open to whatever songs were requested, no matter how crazy or stupid, they would be played. And someone requested the Yoda bad lip reading Seagulls song. If you don't know what we're talking about, look it up.
Yeah, it's from The Last Jedi. And they just made a new one, actually.
No, not The Last Jedi. The Return of the Jedi. The Last Jedi is from the new
trilogy. That's right. They just made a new one from The Last Jedi.
Yes, something about walking on a beach, right?
Something like that. But it was funny because she answered all the RCP questions with YouTube videos as like jokes. She was just like Rick rolling us. Mm-hmm. And I was like, all right, she requested this song. It's going in there.
It's
and
happening.
Then I was going through the list right before we sent it to Abraham, and Lizzie's like, I was like, where's this song? She's like, I didn't put it on there. I thought it was I didn't think that would make sense. I was like, no,
it's got to go on there.
Yeah.
I think I was the only one dancing to it.
I saw some people. I wanted to, but I was in the back talking to her and other people.
Right.
But yeah, I saw some people sort of dancing to it. A lot of people were like, what
is this? All the old people have no idea what it is. Anyways, you went on your honeymoon, and part of that was going to Nashville. Was that your first time? Was that Lizzie's first time?
It was Lizzie's first time to Nashville. Part of it was in Nashville. Most of it was in Asheville.
Asheville and Nashville. Yeah. Not to be confused.
No. 2 different states.
Right.
First time in Asheville. I've been to Nashville many a times, actually.
What's in Asheville? I don't know anything about it.
Not a lot. Major landmarks would be the Biltmore, which is a house very similar to like Downton Abbey.
Oh.
One of like this rich dude who moved out during like the colony time. No, it was like he built this house. It was one of the times when like your home was kind of your heirloom to your family. So he built this giant house, had a lot of money. I forgot from what. And then he built the land that he bought was not only like massive and like just like Downton Abbey with hunting and like has a vineyard on there now too and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. He loved wine, but it was actually built. So every tree, the streams, the rocks that like the streams would flow over were meticulously placed to create like a beautiful landscape.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was fascinating. It was really cool.
That actually reminds me of, I studied for like a month in China, and we got to go to the city of Suzhou, which is famous for their gardens, like the Chinese gardens. And they build like these elaborate gardens with a combination of rock and water, a special rock from one place in China. And everyone is different, and it's supposed to be a unique like flow of water and earth, kind of like you said, where they bring this earth into the place and shape the waterfalls and everything exactly. And that's where you get like the weird like round doors and stuff.
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah.
Like, that's all the Chinese gardens. So I got to like study that kind of stuff for a while. It's pretty cool.
It was very much like that, as well as like he had one of the first indoor bowling alleys.
Oh, so this is more recent. How old is bowling? Is bowling an old sport?
No, but he probably had it in his house before like the White House did. Is what I'm saying. So the house was built like 1900s, maybe late 1800s.
Man, I was still thinking like 1700s. Like this thing was around during the Civil War and the Revolutionary War.
I don't know. It's sad. I should know this stuff. I went, but
all right.
Another really cool thing. They have a hotel that was built like early 1900s as well. It's a Omni Hotel, which is a popular chain, but it looks like a Hobbit house.
Oh,
but like massive,
okay.
like 15 or more stories, but like it's very all brick and old, and then it has that like the roofing of like a Hobbit house,
like grass.
Yeah, but almost like rounded.
Yeah.
So like it looks, it's rectangular, but all the corners are round, and it looks very round, and
Interesting.
it was really cool.
That's
Yeah.
really strange. Okay.
And then other than like a few things, it just has good food, like really like a lot of $3 sign, $4 sign restaurants, and has the most breweries per capita. So
that explains it.
yeah,
There you go.
there we go.
So speaking of your honeymoon, though, because you were gone, you took kind of a late start to Exodus 90.
I did.
And you actually took in some media.
I did.
What did you take in?
We completely watched in our reality house, which was like a cabin that had like no TV, so you're supposed to, kind of step you away from reality. So we very quickly latched on to Disney Plus and binged.
Wait, so you guys caved? You're so anti-Disney.
It's not our Disney Plus,
Oh, okay.
but it is a legal Disney Plus, and we watched The Mandalorian.
And
It was fun.
it was fun.
Yeah,
Very high-paced.
yeah. You've seen
part.
you've seen Firefly?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's Doctor Who and Firefly as a Star Wars show.
Kind of, yeah.
Like essentially, I understand because I know we talked about it once.
It's like a space western.
Yes, but we talked about like with the idea that there was no like plot.
Mm-hmm.
But that's because people were looking for like a hook that continued through, and just like Doctor Who and just like Firefly, each episode was its own.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, this is the adventure of this episode, and like once you're like, oh, this is what they made, that's when you're like, okay, I can just accept.
Yeah, Firefly especially was kind of wacky because they released the episodes out of order. So even if there were a running story through the whole thing, no one
Which there
would
was.
have known. Yeah, it became more apparent later on.
It was the same way with this one, where like the underlying story was essentially like a Baby Yoda story. But other than that, Firefly was like people that joined their crew that you were like mystery background. That was it. But other than that, every episode was like, okay, we got this heist. Okay, now this heist. Now this heist.
And they were all disconnected.
So
except for the doctor.
It was fun. I think it was a little overhyped. Having come in so late.
I agree.
For what it was.
Even if I watched it as it came out, and I think it was overhyped too.
But it's the only good thing on Disney Plus.
Oh, no way.
I mean, that's
Out of the
new
box.
to me. I told Lizzie, I'm glad we didn't, like, we're not paying for this, because besides the Marvel movies and besides what else, there's something else.
Out of the box.
Anyways, besides the Marvel movies, really.
Dude, there's so much good stuff on Disney Plus.
No, there's not.
I don't. Hold on. Did you watch Disney Channel growing up?
Yeah.
What? Then how can you not be excited? They have all the Disney originals.
It takes something special for me to rewatch it.
Okay, that's fair.
And the directors and type of movies I like are not on Disney Plus.
That's true. That's very true. I understand your statement now.
If I have kids one day, Disney Plus is fantastic.
Yeah.
Because it's something I can show them, and I don't mind watching it too.
Yeah.
But right now, like, for my own free will.
Yeah, you have a much more sophisticated taste in cinema.
It's maybe pretentious.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think you actually care about not just the story, but how the movie's done, and a lot of.
I mean, Disney is great. They make fantastic stuff. It's just I've seen most of it. That's it.
So other than that,
we also binged The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
Okay.
Which is an Amazon Prime original show, and it is a woman. It's all about like the 1950s, 1960s, and eventually 1970s, and it's a lot of the Jewish culture in that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like the Jews living that time, and Maisel is a woman who, through a divorce very quickly on, which is very uncommon in that time. So like, because she's divorced, it's kind of her fault, even though he left her.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing that makes her important is like being a wife. She ends up going into stand-up comedy. and women were not in stand-up comedy. So it's this whole story
I saw
of
something about
it's all this story of like money and wealth and religion in that time, as well as women and women's rights, and then like comedy as well, because also you meet other comics and it's like what comedy was in that time. Fantastic show. After 70 more days, I would highly recommend you checking it out. It's really, really good.
Not that I'm counting, but I think it's like 77.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely saw an ad for that or something, maybe on YouTube before Exodus 90.
Yeah, they just came out with the 3rd season, so that's probably why.
Okay, cool.
And then other stuff, but I'll save it for just so I can stretch these out.
Yeah, I think I'm going to share most of the stuff that I took in right before Exodus 90 started. So, well, first off, I never mentioned this before, but one of the things I'm doing this year is I'm trying to read the entire Bible and Catechism in 1 year. So the Coming Home Network, it's a network for, I think, mostly Protestants who are converting to Catholicism.
Okay.
But they have this whole plan where they have this reading list of what you're supposed to read each day and to read the entire Catechism and Bible. So I've been trying to knock that out, and it's actually been awesome. Gotten to read every single day and like really, really read it and take the time to take notes and everything. So that's been really cool. So I've been doing that. I've been reading actual books a lot more too, because I can't watch anything or waste time on social media and stuff. So all those like free books that I get and read and then complain about because they're really bad. I read one called Slave Warrior Queen by Morgan Rice. It was decent, a little weird. And then I was actually on a weird kick of the song Creep by Radiohead.
Oh, so good.
For a while.
Yeah.
And it was like a weird obsession for a little bit.
Remind me when we finish this to show you the choir version of that song.
Can't.
Never mind.
It's so frustrating. But around that same time, I got really into some of my actually favorite musicians, but I hadn't listened to them in a while. So Callum Scott, James Arthur, and James Bay, mostly British musicians, I guess, but they have kind of a cool sound to them that I really like. And then I was on a Haley Reinhart kick. But the one that I'm most excited to point out to you is one that I accidentally came across when I was listening to Matt Maher radio on Spotify the other day, because we can only listen to uplifting music or music that lifts our soul to God, whatever the criteria is. So it recommended this band. It's a Christian punk rock band that does Disney covers.
Oh, God.
It's amazing.
Oh, gosh. Oh, gosh.
Oh, gosh. No, it's fantastic. So they're called Stellar Cart.
Okay.
The lyrics on some of them are like what you'd expect from a Christian punk rock band. Some of them are decent, but the Disney covers are really fun.
Sounds like a loophole.
It is. It absolutely is. But they're Christian. So
talk to my leader about this.
Yeah, do it. See what happens. But no, I've been really enjoying it. I played some of their music, some of their Disney covers at my middle school Edge night the other day. And the core members were like, is this some kind of like Christian punk rock band? This is like when I was growing up. This is amazing. And so a bunch of them were like, started following them on Spotify, like right there. I was like, nice. I'm advocating.
That's awesome. I know a lot of bands like that because of Hawk.
Oh, yeah.
Who grew up in like post-core, but was also straight edge during that time. So we listened to a lot of those type of bands. And then would also know lead singers that would leave like secular post-core bands to start like post-rock Christian bands.
Oh, yeah. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I thought you were trying to say post-Christian.
No.
I'm following.
Like the genre post-rock.
Yeah.
There's like pre-rock, post-rock, punk rock.
Yeah. So that's been really fun. I was on a pretty solid kick of them a lot. That was like my workout music, because you know how we have to go to the gym, but listening to Audrey Assad in the gym is just, it like doesn't do it for me, you know?
Yeah.
So that's my gym music now. And the other thing I want to talk about this week is actually something that I was really, really dreading. And you know this, it's something we talked about, I think last week or the week before.
Mm-hmm.
But we had several people request the Netflix movie, The Two Popes. And so, as we said, if anyone requests it, we will break our Exodus 90 fast to do some research, take in whatever you request, and do a show on that. So, today's episode is on the movie, The Two Popes. This is going to be different than some of the other stuff we've done, because it is supposed to be Catholic to a certain extent. Obviously, it's Catholic through the lens of atheists, I guess. I don't know what they actually are. They're not Catholic.
That's a bold statement.
Well, it is. But it's through the lens of non-Catholics, essentially. And so it's a little bit different than what we normally do, because part of what I did when I watched this is I did do a lot of fact checking, just because it was hard not to. It was so blatant, some of the claims that they were making. So some of this will be like fact checking, but then also we want to be able to take, after we've kind of torn apart like what's true and what's false, we still want to do the Christian culture thing and find like what in this, if it's not the facts, if it's not the reality of what really is happening, we need to figure out like what is good about this that people really enjoy. So that's kind of what it's going to look like. So without further ado, we'll jump right into it. If you don't know much about this, it's basically
we talked about this, I think, the last episode or the episode before. This is my take on the trailer. I haven't seen the movie, and so you can correct me. But sure. The way I would summarize this movie is they took two characters, Pope Benedict, and what's his name in the movie? It's not Pope.
Cardinal Bergoglio.
Cardinal Berbiglia, and Pope Benedict, in the lens of the director and the person who wrote the script, is basically a Catholic who is they took the most general versions of these characters. So they took a Catholic liberal, which would be
they use a progressive is what they use in this,
and then a Catholic conservative, which would be Pope Benedict, and they had a conversation and relationship to discuss Catholic doctrine and the issues in the church and how we should react to those, more leaning towards Bergoglio,
yeah. That's essentially it. So those are our two main characters. So Joseph Ratzinger, also known as Pope Benedict XVI, is played by Anthony Hopkins, who's most famous for playing Hannibal Lecter.
Mm-hmm. I love Anthony Hopkins.
Yeah.
He's also played a priest, though.
Has he?
Yeah, in The Rite.
Oh, okay. I know him from playing Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah.
And then we have Jorge Bergoglio.
He's also played Thor's father.
That's true.
It's another big one.
Yeah. So Jorge Bergoglio, also known as Pope Francis the First, if you're keeping count, played by Jonathan Pryce. And this one is actually, it's really funny. And you mentioned this whenever we talked about it, that they look super identical. And people wanted a movie about this ever since he came up in Game of Thrones, because he plays a character in Game of Thrones where he's like essentially kind of like the high priest of a religious faction. Yeah. But everyone's like, this dude looks exactly like Pope Francis. They need to make something where he plays Pope Francis. And so they made something where he plays Pope Francis. So he plays High Sparrow in Game of Thrones, and then he's Governor Swan from Pirates of the Caribbean too. So those
Caribbean,
however you want to say it. Those are some big things. So one of the things I noticed, I was doing a lot of fact checking, and I was like seeing there's a ton of articles that are going through and like how much of this is actually real. Even Vanity Fair had one, and I was like, the Vanity Fair one was actually decently accurate, what I was comparing with a lot of other things too. But one of the things I want to point out in this movie, they take a lot of real footage and they take snippets of it and they put it in certain places to make it seem like it has more authority or make it look more like they're living up to exactly what happened.
Okay.
They kind of use it to build their authority, I guess, or
trust,
validity. Yeah. That what they're telling is exactly how it was portrayed.
That's their way of building a relationship with the viewer.
Exactly. So there's kind of an opening scene, but I want to flash right away it flashes forward to the year 2005 in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And we have Pope Francis, so at the time, Cardinal Bergoglio. Oh, now you're going to have me mess it up. Bergoglio. And he's preaching and talking about the story of St. Francis. As a piece of foreshadowing, throughout this whole movie, he references St. Francis multiple times. But the homily, he's giving a homily. It's like an outdoor mass in the streets, basically. And he's giving this homily about St. Francis, and he's explaining the whole rebuild my church, which is also foreshadowing of how Pope Francis is perceived as being the one to come in and rebuild the church and fix it after Pope Benedict kind of messed it up.
Right.
At least that's the perception. So immediately after that, he is told that John Paul II died. So this is like the day of, essentially. And then we have this news anchor, newsman, whatever. He says, John Paul II's papacy, and I quote, marked a harsh condemnation of homosexuality, abortion, contraception, and the ordination of women and married men. So first off, I want to point out that John Paul II didn't teach anything that was different from the Catholic Church, which already states that, first off, you should love those people as people. And so it kind of, in small ways too, just uses like the phrasing of harsh condemnation rather than the fact that we disagree with it morally, kind of things like that. So that's just a small thing. But so from the very beginning, they're kind of painting this picture of JP2 and Benedict being the extreme right. Then we go to our first scene in the Vatican. And this is where I kind of lost it. So this is about 4 minutes in. So we have a priest who's quizzing the then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger over different cardinals who might be elected pope, kind of like a politician who's studying his opponents, essentially. Mm-hmm. So the second one that he mentions is Cardinal Arinze of Nigeria. And Joseph Ratzinger says that people think that he may be the first African pope. And this is something I remember people saying even when Pope Francis was elected, because there was different African popes that were considered in the top running for that too. That's not true. We've already had several popes from Africa. The first one, I actually looked it up. So the actual first one was Pope Victor I. He was the 14th pope ever. So we've had, like, from the very beginning, essentially, we've had him. And there's other ones too. You can look them up. And it's been a while, I'll give you that. But there's definitely been African popes before. So, and Benedict, being theologian and historian,
probably would have known that.
Would have definitely known that. So then, right after he shows that cardinal, the priest shows him Jorge Bergoglio. And Benedict kind of just looks at it like, are you serious? Like, this guy is one of the guys that you think is going to be like a contender for me? And so the priest starts to explain like who he is, because he takes it as Benedict just doesn't know who he is. And he's like, I know who he is. He's the reformer. And it kind of leaves it as that. And then we have a barrage of news stories that portray, they keep using the words reformers and conservatives, talking about each of the different candidates, reformers and conservatives. And those are the two words that they use portrayed throughout the entire thing. So kind of like what we were saying before, we were using liberal instead of reformer, but that's the terminology they use. So the two of them actually meet before anything goes down for the election of the papacy. They meet washing their hands in the restroom, and Pope Francis is whistling Dancing Queen by ABBA. If you know that song.
I do. Love that song.
Yeah. If you think about it, this song is actually about a 17-year-old girl who's going clubbing to like pick up guys and like bounce from guy to guy. So a little bit weird, especially for the future pope to be whistling.
Hey, he can listen to whatever he wants to listen to.
I know.
And you get the song stuck in your head. It's not, you can't help it.
So Ratzinger, he's like, oh, what hymn are you whistling? And so they're painting him as like this complete idiot who doesn't know like culture at all. And so they have this conversation, and Jorge Bergoglio is like, oh, it's Dancing Queen by ABBA. He's like, well, who's ABBA? And just like all this stuff, like trying to make him look like he's really out of touch. And then they do the same thing with the Beatles later on, and like soccer, which we'll get to that later. And then right after that, they're having this big meet and greet with all the cardinals and stuff before the election. And Ratzinger comes in like a politician and greeting everyone and smiling and shaking hands and stuff. And then he looks at Bergoglio, doesn't say anything, doesn't shake his hand, walks away. And he's portrayed as like this real big jerk. And they even say like, he just ignored you. He didn't even say anything. And so this is all in the first 5 minutes. We have him portrayed as this completely out of touch, ultra conservative, really, really wants power and is running like a politician. And then right after that, they vote for the new pope. I want to point out that of the entire movie, this is one of the scenes that I think is the most accurate from all the research I've done. I was actually curious a couple months ago, like what the process was as far as what they tell us happens within the Sistine Chapel for the election. And from what was portrayed in the movie from what I've researched, they were actually pretty similar. So I'm not an expert, but it seems pretty good. Obviously, we don't actually know the results of each election. They're not going to tell us like the numbers of how close it was, but they can splurge on that and guess. So as the Cardinals are all eating after the first vote failed, they're all talking about reform and trying to move their votes from one reformer to the other because they didn't have enough votes to stop Benedict. And so they're trying to do like this whole political thing. And Bergoglio says he doesn't want it. And the rest of them are like, that's exactly why it needs to be you, because you don't want it. And then they say, that's why Ratzinger can't be elected, because he really, really wants it. And then again, they portray him going around and politicking, shaking hands, smiling, and stuff like that. That's not true either. In fact, if you look it up, this whole story of the movie about Pope Francis not wanting the papacy is actually more like Benedict's story. So he actually, on at least 3 separate occasions, tried to retire. And he was old enough to do so, but JP2 wouldn't let him because he was so important to like the doctrine of faith that he was in charge of. And then he retired early, which doesn't really seem like someone who was power hungry and wanted to be in office. He wasn't pope for super long or anything. So it just doesn't really seem correct, especially with him trying to retire multiple times beforehand. I'm just going to try and run through some of this stuff real quick, and then we can do some themes. So eventually, obviously, he's elected, and he walks out, and he's just like celebrating, like a racer that just won. He's like got his hands up in the air, and the interviews start immediately. And the first ones are very supportive of Pope Benedict and saying actually really good things about how he's going to fight relativism. He has great theology, both really true. And then they get kind of negative and start talking about how he's a Nazi. And so the truth is, if you know anything about his past, he was forced when he was 16 years old to join the Hitler Youth right at the end of World War II.
Oh, yeah.
But his family was actually like very big anti-Nazi activists. But he was forced, like many other teenagers at the time, to join Hitler Youth. He was never actually a Nazi, and he never fought. And so they go on saying that he needs to stop being so conservative, otherwise everyone's going to leave the church. So we fast forward to 2011, so 6 years later, we have Cardinal Bergoglio. See, now you're messing me up, man.
Cardinal Booger.
Cardinal Bergoglio, he's trying to retire. He's trying to get away from this whole thing because now he knows he's one of those that are potentially going to be elected if there's ever a re-election, basically. And as he keeps submitting his resignation over and over and over, he's not hearing anything back from Pope Benedict. And then he gets a letter from Pope Benedict asking him to come to the Vatican for a different reason. And just something small, at the airport, he refuses to let the driver carry his bags. He's dressed in casual clothes, not like a priest. He only wants to sit in the front seat. He doesn't want to be treated special or anything. He just wants to like talk with the people, which I think is really, really cool. I don't know if he does all that. I know he carries his own bag a lot, and he has that bag that he carries with him like everywhere. I don't know about the rest of that, but it does seem like a interesting way of like showing how he wants to be with the people, which is something that's really big for Pope Francis.
I do think it was. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know if that's true, but I know kind of a line. Like it's a good way to paint his personality. He was very someone who,
right.
When he started, people were like, "You're changing the way the Pope kind of works." And he's like, "That's what I want to do."
So right after this, as he's traveling, the whole thing about Benedict's assistant who was accused of pedophilia and was sent to prison was on the news as he was traveling. And once they come together and they start talking, so they go to Castle Gandolfo, which is the summer home of the Pope. They're having the majority of their conversations happen there.
Okay.
And they're sitting in the gardens and talking. And one of the very first things that Benedict says is he was talking about how great that guy was. And then Pope Francis is like, well, he's in jail now. And it's kind of like this awkward, like, do you really think he's great? And when he just was like accused of being a pedophile. So right after that, they keep, Benedict starts listing off all these things that Bergoglio is doing to kind of stand out, like things that are bad in Benedict's opinion. So the first one, Bergoglio refuses to live in the palace where the rest of the cardinals stay when they visit the Vatican. And so because of that, he's like, are you trying to make the rest of us look bad and make us feel like we're being pompous and stuff like that? And then the next thing, Benedict says that Bergoglio has spoken out against himself, so Benedict, behind his back and has said a lot of things contrary to the church, specifically on homosexuality and married priests. And Bergoglio denies that and is like, I've been taken out of context. Later on, he kind of recants that a little bit and actually does stand up for saying that homosexuality is something that the church needs to kind of get with, and the whole married priest thing too. Which the married priest thing is something, if you're familiar with church teaching, can actually change. Like priests can get married. There are married priests right now.
Really depends on the need.
That's something that comes up later.
How much of what you just said about their conversation so far, do you know validity or truth in that based on your research?
Like, did that exact conversation ever happen?
Not the exact conversation. Did Berbuglia ever talk behind so-and-so's back about certain church doctrine and all these agendas? Did all those things kind of actually happen? And after you answer that question, I have some themes I want to jump into.
Yeah, sure. So I don't think so. So first off, one of the things is when you retire, you just send a letter. You don't actually go to the person. So this conversation where they met up ahead of time and had this, like, none of this actually happened. So as far as that happening...
So wait, did I miss something? Is Pope Benedict already retiring? Or did he?
No.
Oh.
So Bergoglio wants to retire.
I see.
So he was sending all those letters trying to retire, and Benedict, he has to get permission
from
Benedict. Right. So that never happened. I think Pope Francis might have tried to retire, possibly. I'm not sure on that. But they never met up. They never had any of these conversations. Did Pope Francis speak behind his back? I don't know.
Okay, that's all. That was the biggest thing. I'm not saying you did know. I just know you said you've looked up multiple.
Yeah, I did.
So I wasn't sure if that came up. Mm-hmm. Okay, I have two things.
Yep.
First thing is I've kind of noticed, I don't know the themes you pulled from this.
Yeah.
But one of the themes that I pulled was, I feel like this is one of the first movies where the theme is actually the making of the movie rather than the movie and what's in the movie. And so this is one Steve would love, but I put, so first topic on the making of the movie, what is truth? And I find it fascinating that, like, you even mentioned, like, Vanity Fair even has, like, people want to know what about this movie is truthful. And right. I think it's interesting that this movie has drawn in a secular crowd, has drawn in people, even what you're talking about, like the coming home movement of people that are Protestants, but maybe converting. It's just like everyone has kind of noticed that, okay, there's this movie about these two people. Okay, there's kind of this agenda. Okay, I kind of agree with the conversation going on here. Wait a minute. Is this a movie? Or is this true? And I think that's huge.
Yeah.
Because I love that we're seeing these things, because it's not something that people are just hearing and saying, this is what happened. Even those that don't necessarily know about Pope Francis or Pope Benedict. And I think that's great, because that's one thing that you and I talk about, like questioning and desiring that. And so it's like, I agree with this movie, but did that actually happen?
Yeah, and I think that's really, really good. I think my biggest fear with this movie and why I'm so, like, against it is I'm afraid that people won't do that. And so we talked about this before, and we know of people who have started participating in the church again because of this movie, and that's fantastic. But if it stops there and there's no, like, research that goes behind it, if you come back to the church because of some of the things that the perceived Pope Francis in this says, you're going to be sorely disappointed when you come back and realize that the majority of what this Pope Francis says is not true.
Right.
And then you're going to be even more angry at the church and at Pope Francis.
Right.
So that's my fear, is this perception. But like you're saying, there are a lot of people who are fact checking, even Vanity Fair, which is really big. So as long as people are doing that, I think that's great, because we want truth. Right. We want everyone to know the truth. That's fantastic. Even in the case of the scandal, we want people to know the truth. And I think that's really important.
And that was my other point. The other thing I had down was basically what we do. And then just this idea, one of the things we talk about on this podcast is living your adventure.
Yeah.
You know, welcome to the adventure. This life is adventure, each one of us. And we just went to this thing, the adventure of discipleship.
Yeah.
And there's this power to storytelling. When it comes to truth, when it comes to beauty, when it comes to what is good. And when I see that in this movie, I see, based on your view of it and your retelling of it so far. And what I kind of assumed going into it is it's just interesting because it seems like they've taken desires of their own and played them into characters that they've created.
For sure.
And used real characters, real names. Mm-hmm. But what I think is fascinating is you can see this in Scripture when Jesus was around. You can see this in the Gospels. And the two sides, you can see this when, I forgot the one Scripture where they're privately discussing what to do with Jesus before Pontius Pilate goes out. Mm-hmm. And there's these two arguments or the different ways that the scribes paint the picture of Jesus.
Yeah.
And essentially every time they're crucifying Jesus. The same way I feel like this director or this writer or someone is trying to crucify Pope Benedict. Or essentially maybe even the church.
Yeah.
In this movie.
For sure.
And I don't know if you wanted to add to that or just take it as, but like the same way that Tolkien or in this venture discipleship talks about telling a story of a venture of truth and beauty.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good comparison. I definitely did not tie that with the scripture at all. And I also didn't realize how long I'd been talking. So thanks for cutting in there. I'm going to skip some stuff, but basically that conversation continues. That's basically the big thing. And it keeps going on and on and on. And eventually Bergoglio keeps just laughing off Benedict's comments and he won't address them. And then it gets kind of heated. And so they're sitting down and Bergoglio says, people are leaving. And Benedict is like, and that's the church's fault? It's because the church, it's not to do with relativism or the Western society or like all this different stuff. And Bergoglio says he doesn't want to be a salesman for a product that he no longer condones. And so he paints this picture of like Pope Francis doesn't believe in the church anymore. And that's kind of what they go through for the rest of this conversation. And Benedict points out, and this is actually something that comes up later, so I do want to make sure I say this. Bergoglio used to be very conservative himself. And that's actually pretty factual. And then later on in the story, he actually, one of my favorite parts, he does a flashback of Pope Francis as a young person before he was even a priest, and then into his priesthood, early priesthood. Then he was exiled into the mountains, and how all that shaped him during the Argentinian dictatorship. It's really, really good. One of the best parts of the movie, in my opinion. So Benedict gets really mad, gets up, walks away, and this is where it gets even more heated. Bergoglio says priests weren't required to be celibate until the 12th century. So he's kind of going through and he's like, the church changes. Change happens all the time. That's true. That's a true fact. You can look it up. Priests weren't required to be celibate until the 12th century. And that's, like we said before, that's a teaching that can change. It's not a moral thing. It's more of a discipline than anything. Right. So then the next fact that he throws out, he says, angels were never even mentioned until the 5th century. That's absolutely false. It's literally in scripture all the way back to most of the Old Testament, all the way to the very beginning. And then the next one, he steps it up even more. He says, nothing is static in nature, not even God himself. And that's literally heresy, right? And Pope Francis has never said this. But I mean, we look at scripture and Jesus, he says, well, first in Hebrews, it says Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. Then we have like, throughout scripture, it says like God is unchanging, right? And then all of theology since has said God is unchanging. And then he goes on even more and says that confession is just a few magic words from a priest. And so that's where it gets kind of weird. So this is one of the few quotes that I want to pull up and see what we can say. So right after that, Bergoglio says, confession cleans the sinner's soul. It does not help the victim. Sin is a wound, not a stain. It needs to be treated and healed. Forgiveness is not enough. Let me say that again. Mm-hmm. Confession cleans the sinner's soul. It does not help the victim. Sin is a wound, not a stain. It needs to be treated and healed. Forgiveness is not enough. I think there's some good in that. So from the very first part, confession cleans the sinner's soul. True. It does not help the victim. Mostly true. I mean, the victim typically has no idea like that they've even repented unless that person has gone back. And then sin is a wound, not a stain. We've talked about that before. Yeah. It's something that a lot of the times it hurts to try and heal that wound, right? You got to clean it out. You got to disinfect it, right? It needs to be treated and healed, and forgiveness is not enough. I get where he's coming from. I think in some situations, forgiveness is very powerful, but there has to be something beyond that. So
I would say forgiveness and absolution. Mm-hmm. So he's saying it heals the soul, but not the victim. I agree, but I also think it's the only way to really heal the soul. And so it's required. Whereas the way he's talking about it is like, we should, like, it's unnecessary.
Yeah.
And that's
right.
not true.
For sure.
It's the only way to heal the soul. So we need that. But yes, there's different factors that go into play with the victim and our own, and that's going to be guilt, which that is something we have to work through. That could be what caused the sin, which, if you're using the term victim, could be something horrific and something that takes time, community, prayer, whatever. What I love is the line, forgiveness is not enough, because I do agree with that. And I think the hardest part with reconciliation is leaving and feeling like nothing happened, leaving and feeling like, okay, what now? It's just going to happen again or whatever. I've had all those different types of thoughts. And it's because being forgiven and having reconciliation isn't enough. It takes one of the 3 theological virtues, and that's faith. Faith in hope, in God. Yeah, all those things that in this sacrament and in this gift that God has given us, that he's saying it's enough. Whether we feel...
Whether we believe it.
Whether we believe, feel, or whatever, it's enough. Because it's not in our eyes. But we have to cling to faith and hope and love that it is enough for God.
Yeah. So after this, we fast forward again. This is a very small part, but Bergoglio, after dinner, goes into like their living room and he starts watching soccer. And then Benedict walks in and is like, oh, what is this? And like, that's another, just because I'm a soccer fan, I got to point this out. Benedict is a huge soccer fan. So is Pope Francis. They both love soccer, and they've both actually spoken about how it's like the spiritual benefits of soccer and sports. So that's just a small thing, another thing. But in this conversation, after they do that, he plays music a little bit. Benedict actually played piano, plays a lot of classical stuff. They have this thing where Benedict says the hardest thing is to hear his voice, God's voice. And Bergoglio's like, even for a pope? And Benedict says, perhaps especially for a pope. We don't have to necessarily break that down, but I think that is very powerful. It makes Bergoglio seem like, come on, you're a cardinal, like you know.
Right.
But it does kind of show something about the struggle of clerics, right? We kind of get this idea of like clericalism sometimes, where the priests and the bishops and the pope above sin and are above like spiritual desolation and stuff like that. And that happens. Sometimes it's hard to hear God's voice. They really play off of that in here and make it later on. It says like Benedict hasn't heard God's voice in a really long time, and that's why his papacy is going to crap, basically. That's not true. But are there going to be times where he doesn't hear God's voice? Absolutely.
Of course, yeah.
Everyone.
There's some great saints where that's happened to them.
Yeah. So right after this is where we eventually they go back to the Vatican because something goes down where more stuff is released on the scandal, essentially. So they go back to the Vatican. And while they're back, they go to the Sistine Chapel, they sit down, and they have this heart-to-heart, basically. And this is where they start to become friends. And Bergoglio tells a story about how he was in love and how he was about to propose. And on his way to propose, he stopped in the church randomly, and everything changed from there. That's fake, too. So the whole love story and the proposal was based off of a letter that he wrote to his crush when he was 12 years old. Oh. So based off a real person, but they were 12.
Right.
And it definitely not engaged. But I'm not going to go into it for the sake of time, but they go into this. It's really interesting. He kind of talks about his background, how he became Jesuit and all that stuff, and how by the age of 36, he was the leader of all the Jesuits in Argentina. And then he gets into all this trouble because that's when the military takeover in Argentina was, and he's in charge of all the Jesuits. They're killing people. And so he like essentially makes this deal with the military leaders where he's working with them, but it protects his priests. And they find out. The priests find out. And they're like, we're not backing down. We have to do what Jesus wants us to do. And Bergoglio says, like, this is one of the greatest sins of my life, and I've never forgiven myself for this. Because he essentially betrayed his people, and all of the priests and his best friends ended up getting killed because they stood up for what they believed in And right after that, once the military was kicked out, he was exiled. The Jesuits sent him into the mountains, and that's where his conversion happened. And all of a sudden, he became the reformer and no longer the conservative. He spent basically his entire days just listening to confessions, and because of that, it led him to become a man of the people, I guess. So that's essentially what that looked like. Throughout this whole thing, Pope Benedict keeps ignoring Bergoglio's attempt to retire. Once they're in the Sistine Chapel, Bergoglio's looking around, and he starts talking about some of the things that he would do as Pope. And Benedict's like, no, keep going. Like, tell me what you would do. And after he's done, Benedict says, I'm going to resign from the papacy. And basically implies, like, I'm going to let you be Pope. Bergoglio gets mad, and they kind of have this argument. This is useless, and I might cut this out later. But my favorite part in the entire movie probably was this stupid joke that Benedict made, because this whole time Pope Francis is funny. Like, he's making jokes and like they have punchlines, but Benedict never gets them because they're references. And Benedict tries to make a joke in this moment as Bergoglio is kind of like panicking, and it's not funny at all, but he straight face says, it's a German joke. It doesn't have to be funny. Oh, I literally lost it. So good. Gosh, I have a weird humor. But in this conversation, this is one of the really big lines. Benedict says, God always corrects one pope by presenting another. I would like to see my correction. All of the articles that I've read about this, everyone sees this as implying that he is admitting that he messed up the papacy and the church, and that he is like intentionally planning Pope Francis to come in as the remedy for that.
Right.
Again, not factual. There's no way that he could even do that if he wanted to, like plan all that and orchestrate that. And then right after that, he says, I don't agree with most of the things you say, think, or do. But for some reason, now I can see a necessity for Bergoglio. And so this is like the kind of change of heart moment, I guess, where all of a sudden this hard, angry conservative has agreed that it's time for change. And he actually says that. He's like, it's time for change later on. So the next big thing is after Bergoglio confesses that whole story about his biggest sin, then Benedict asks him to hear his confession. And it cuts out, and it's like you're underwater so that you don't hear the whole conversation. But the last thing you hear is he mentions a name, and he says, do you remember, insert the name of the priest here. I don't remember the actual name, but it's a real name of a priest who Benedict was accused of covering up his involvement in a pedophilia scandal. And it's basically him confessing to covering up the whole thing. This was already disproven in real life. The whole thing took place during JP2's time as Pope. And as soon as Benedict became the Pope, he's the one that actually took action against the guy. So again, not founded whatsoever. I've already talked about how Benedict right at this moment says that he's resigning because he prays to God, but he never hears his voice. Obviously, that's not why. He was old. He was tired. He never wanted it to begin with. All he ever wanted to do, and this is why he tried to retire multiple times, he wanted to go back to Germany, pray, and write theology. That's all he ever wanted to do. And then the last couple of things I want to point out before we can jump into the final themes. He retires. We have Cardinal Bergoglio elected Pope Francis, and the famous line, "The carnival is over." I don't know if you remember that when he was elected. That was like something all the newspapers said that he said. I looked it up. The guy who was actually there that he supposedly said it to said it was never actually a thing. So that's Monsignor Guido Marini. He said the actual words that he was told was, "I prefer not to wear that." So not that it's a huge difference, but comparing like all the smells and bells to a carnival or a circus,
right,
versus just saying, "I prefer to not do that."
Yeah.
It has a huge, I guess, connotation with it. And then one of the most beautiful parts of the whole thing is soon as he's elected, he walks out to greet everyone. And the first thing he does is he prays with them for Pope Emeritus Benedict. And that was really cool to see. Like, that's kind of not how it ended. There was some stuff after that, but that's basically the end of the actual like context of the whole thing. So one of the major themes that I wanted to point out is what people love about Pope Francis is that he's at least portrayed as very real and very caring towards people. And I think that's very real about the person of who Pope Francis is. He wants to be among the people. He's always had his thing about smelling like these sheep. So I think that's the first thing I want to talk about. And in this movie, especially, he's trying to get rid of everything except for the roots of the faith, going back to like serving the poor and getting rid of any, like, I don't want to say any organized religion, but it kind of seems like it. Yeah. And just getting down to like the apostles walking through and performing miracles, healing and stuff like that. So I just want to talk about like his personality and the way that he approaches people. So any thoughts on that?
Not particularly. I mean, I guess the only thing that I really wrote down was like, this movie seems like another dialogue of the church versus politics.
Yeah.
And that like at this time,
and church politics.
Right. But at this time, it seems like the church works the same way that politics and politicians do. And like almost like the House does. Like the election for the new Pope runs the same way as like electing a new head of the house or head of all those things. And it's not to say there isn't politics behind it. Like you said, there are church politics, but it's not the same. And so I think with what you're saying here, besides his true personality being shown in this movie, is also, it almost seems like his dialogue is to eradicate the politics in the church. Yeah. So it gets back to what is real.
Yeah. Yeah. And to be fair, in the past, the politics of the church have definitely been just as bad, if not worse, than the politics of like the governments.
Yeah.
Especially like the Renaissance area papacy. Stuff got really bad then. And so, I mean, I don't know. I'm not in the College of Cardinals.
Me neither.
It could be that bad. I don't know. I would hope that it's not quite as bad as people portray it as. I know we do have some very good cardinals that are kind of like thrown under the bus, with some of them that are sometimes not as good. But I do think the realness of Pope Francis is something that's really attractive. And I think that's one of the things about this movie that people really enjoy, because people love someone who's real and that's approachable, and that they feel like, I mean, you look at Pope Francis, he's adorable.
Yeah.
He's like the adorable
sweetest
old
man.
So the next thing, we actually had several teens that reached out to me who requested this. My teens from my youth group. And I texted them earlier and I was like, what about this specifically was something that drew you into the movie, that you really enjoyed? Because they did express that even with all the like things that were factually inaccurate, they still enjoyed it. So I just want to get like their perspective, because I don't want to be super biased, you know? And so one of them said the holy friendship, essentially, that developed between the two of them. And so you see especially after the announcement of his resignation, they really start to bond. And by the end of the movie, the very last scene as the credits are rolling is the two of them watching the World Cup game together, Argentina versus Germany in the finals. And they're both loving it.
Right.
And obviously that never happened. But it's adorable. It's like this great friendship that most likely was not a thing. But most of us who are soccer fans and Catholics at that time during that game were like, what if they're watching this right now? And so it's kind of cool to see that happen. But the whole point is like this friendship between the two of them. And I think there's something about authentic friendship that is really attractive to us as human beings. So I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I think this goes hand in hand with what we're doing right now with Exodus.
Yeah, for sure.
One of the three pillars, and there's three, is fraternity. And I know it's like a male word, but same with women. Like there's something, like we're called to do it once a week, if not more. And then there's something about, even though there are differences within two people, even though there are completely different views, completely different takes, even in the spiritual life, which is actually extremely common too nowadays in Christianity and Catholicism and all these things. If it takes real, honest dialogue and real, honest response to what you're hearing, first like listening, but hearing, in order, like, you know, Pope Francis, while he was cardinal, wanted to resign. And the other guy was like, no, because you're actually good. And then vice versa, and all these things of like lifting each other up while calling them out.
Yeah, that's exactly what I had in my notes.
And there's this realm, and you see this movie because I'm sure it's like an hour and 50 minutes long, of persistence in that. Like, not only just like, oh, well, I tried. No, like relentless persistence in this dialogue, that by the end they're like, like, you know everything about me. It's literally Pope Benedict, who, I mean, maybe it didn't happen, but like confessed.
Right.
So like all these things, you know everything about me. I'm stripped everything, so I'm naked with you now. Like, I'm that vulnerable. So all I have left is to love and be friends with you.
Right. Yeah, and there's something about, like, in the last several scenes, it seems like a very authentic joy that they share together, which is really cool. There's one scene where they have the security guard go out and order pizza and sodas from this middle of nowhere shop, and they sit and eat pizza together, and they're just joking and eating. And it's just this adorable couple of old guys. It almost looks like...
It's like grumpy old men. Like
except
movie.
They're joyful.
Right.
Instead. Yeah, exactly. And even when they pretended to not listen to each other, specifically Benedict to Bergoglio, you find out later he was listening the whole time. It just wasn't time for him to respond yet, because he couldn't say too early that he was resigning. He had to wait until the right moment. And so he was listening the whole time. And so that's another thing. Even when they pretended like they weren't having this friendly conversation, Benedict knew this was happening. He just was waiting for the right time.
And that's the part about those kind of relationships. It's in this realm of disagreement and different mindset that you still respect the other person and what they're saying. You don't reject it altogether. And that's where I think, I mean, just not even in friendship or relationships, but that's just where I think the issue with dialogue today has gone wrong. As soon as someone says something we disagree with, we just stop listening.
Yeah.
Even because we don't want to respond, or because we're just like, nope. And I mean, you watched this whole movie. Even though. So...
Yeah, even though,
yeah,
I wasn't a huge fan, but that's the whole point. Like, we're trying to find the good things within that, right? And I'll admit, like, I really struggled because I got a little flustered over like some of the very blatant kind of shots at the church. But as I sat down and started thinking about it, I'm like, there's good stuff in here, and there were some scenes, like I said, that I really enjoyed and that I burst out laughing to. So one of the next things that one of my teens pointed out was the background story of Bergoglio in Argentina. I didn't go into detail with that, but it's really cool to see the psychological change of like his past. And I don't know much about that time period, to be completely honest, of Pope Francis. But from the little research I did in the last couple of days, it actually seems, maybe not the details, but the general story seems pretty accurate of what happened. And I think one of the things that's attractive about this is the vulnerability of the Pope, and both of them, sharing, I messed up. And I messed up in a really, really big way. And I hurt. And I'm really, really hurting. And there's one point where they just like hug it out. And they tango together, you know? And it's this idea that like, kind of the St. Peter thing, where St. Peter was one of the most venerated saints in the early church, not because he was the first pope, although that was a big thing, but because he messed up and came back. In most of early Christian art, when Peter was shown or displayed in the art, they showed him as a rooster, as like a kind of not a slap in the face, but a reminder of, if he can mess up and be pope, then what do we have to do to not be forgiven? And so I think there's something with that too in these last couple of scenes where they're pouring their heart out in their biggest sins. True or not, I don't know.
Right.
Or one of the things that I kind of had an issue with that is when Benedict said his sin, Pope Francis, or Bergoglio, kind of freaks out and like almost doesn't absolve him. And for a moment, like I get it, because it's still happening. And it's still a deep cut. But at the same time, why do we see one sin is forgivable and the other not? Because of Bergoglio's action, literally hundreds, if not thousands of people were killed, right? And that's pretty significant. I'm not saying that this pedophilia thing is not significant at all. Like, I think it is. But why is one forgivable and the other not? I just think that's something to kind of ponder, because eventually he does give absolution. But I think a lot of the times in our mindset, and myself included, like when I was watching it, I was like, I kind of dismissed the fact that hundreds, if not thousands of people died because of his actions, because it had happened 50 years ago.
Yeah. When we say anything is unforgivable, the best way to explain the issue with that without like making anybody feel uncomfortable or mad or anything, is that knowing that forgiveness comes from God.
Mm-hmm.
And when we say something definite like that, then we're putting limitations on
Yeah.
what God is and God's forgiveness. And we can't do that.
Yeah. I mean, the only sin that scripture tells us is unforgivable is blasphemy against the Spirit, which literally means like believing the Spirit can't forgive you.
Right.
So one of the next things, and actually the last thing that one of my teens told me, is one of the big things they really enjoyed is the very fact that Netflix is taking interest in the Catholic world. Even if it's not necessarily an accurate portrayal, they see it kind of as man's innate draw to religion or fascination with that, even if it's not fairly portrayed. You seem kind of iffy on that.
Yeah. No, I mean, the more I think about it, the more I can agree with that. I like I said, I haven't seen this movie. I thought it was cool too. When I first saw it, I was like, huh. And then you saw the trailer and you're like, oh. And like I said, I think it's a tool for Netflix or whoever, not even Netflix, because I know how Netflix now makes things, having heard how Scorsese made The Irishman. Mm-hmm. They just kind of like walk in and like, here, do whatever you want. And they leave. And so I think it's a tool for whoever made the film to have this dialogue of their own. But it is cool because this person did want to have dialogue about church doctrine.
Yeah.
It is something that in this way isn't being discussed. And like it wasn't a complete, just like the movie started and then, you know, things happen. And then by the end, they're like, oh, the church is wrong. This is what the church believes. This is what is true, blah, 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 blah. And like totally, it was rather this conversation with these two people that are in the church living this faith and the one person or either person, like whether one person's painted bad and the other person's painting good, the person that's essentially portrayed as the good guy with proper beliefs is of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like maybe a lose-win in that way, but it is cool in those ways. Like it is cool because it's a Christian dialogue, but I also disagree a little bit because I think it was just more of like a tool for the person telling a story.
For sure. And this is definitely like getting back to like the very root of it where like we're still, the very fact that it's being used as a tool shows that it's still something that's on our hearts. And what you said actually leads into what I want the last point to be. And this is something that I found when I was reading an interview that was done by someone actually not related to the movie at all, I don't think. His name is Chris Donahue. He's a Oscar-winning filmmaker. And I looked it up. He actually studied at Jesuit Prep in Dallas, which is one of the schools that used to send kids to the Pines, I think. So I might have worked with kids from that school. But what he said is apparently he's calling it a comedy. And not in the like ha 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 sense.
But like a Shakespeare way, right?
Yeah. And so this is what he said. The great thing about the film is not that it's a theological treatise, but the story of hope and an unlikely friendship. And then he goes on to compare it to a modern divine comedy where each pope experiences their own inferno, purgatorio, and paradiso. And so it's this kind of conversion of experiencing themselves at their worst, where you have those flashbacks, and then you have this transformation process where even though the paradiso is a little bit like skewed to one biased perspective, you still see that transformation of the Divine Comedy by Dante.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's going off of what you said, where it's not supposed to be a theological treatise. It's supposed to be a story about two friends finding hope in this relationship.
Yeah.
With that, we'll go into some challenges. The first one I think is easy. Have a dialogue with someone of a different belief than you. I think that has to be in there somewhere.
I would specify when you say different belief than you, it doesn't have to be like religious belief. Well, when I say religious, I mean like of another religion. Mm-hmm. If there's someone you know that you're like, this person, we're in the same religion and they're a hypocrite, we'll go strike up a conversation about something that you're like, why do you think this? Or why do you do this? If this,
or politics.
I'm the worst at wanting to talk. I don't want to talk about politics. Is what I mean.
Yeah. And so maybe just some tips with that is listen.
Yep.
Don't get angry. If you catch yourself getting angry, don't talk. Just listen. And in those situations, sometimes it's best to just ask questions. Like, okay, why do you think that? And not say like, why do you think that? But why? And try to understand where they're coming from. And not only is that beneficial to the relationship because it lets the person feel heard, but it also helps you understand that person's perspective. And even if it's a little selfishly, in the future, if you ever want to defend your own perspective, if they don't change your mind, that is, if they don't change your mind, theoretically, you should be able to strongman the other person's argument, which is when you take someone else's argument, give it the best perspective or best argument possible, and then refute that. So if your opinion actually is correct, then you should be able to give the best argument for the other person. So make sure you're listening and being calm.
One reason I don't like talking about politics is because I don't know enough, or if anything. And so I know another thing with that challenge is like, well, I don't know enough about church doctrine. I don't know this. I think striking up a conversation like that with someone isn't to have a debate or isn't to respond. Like literally, if they want to start asking you questions, you're like, honestly, you can literally say, I don't know enough to talk about this. I was just curious because I know I think or to believe or feel differently. And I just wanted to know where you got what you know and all these things. I'm actually going to go home and look this up because this is interesting. Mm-hmm. And then you go home, whether you got angry or disagreed with whatever, let that out on your own and then look stuff up based on what they said and just be like, okay, I'm learning. And then it either furthers your belief of why and now you're getting reasons to now talk to other people about, or you can go back and be like, hey, I looked this up and look, I found this, which is kind of more in line with what I believe. What do you think?
I feel like you're describing my relationship with this movie right now, where I didn't agree. I took 2 hours and 5 minutes and I listened to what he had to say. I did my research. Like, I actually had fun with that too. So that's another good thing that came out of this is I actually had to go do digging. I learned more about Pope Francis than I didn't know before. And now we're having that dialogue because of that.
Yeah.
So a weird way of looking at that. But do you have any other challenges?
No.
Okay, then shout outs. I want to shout out Gracie and Ty and all the other teen leaders from the Monday Bible study who suggested this, but especially Gracie and Ty because they were the ones who helped give me some feedback.
Yeah.
And yes, it is the Ty.
The Ty.
The Ty.
I don't really have any major shout outs. I had someone that came to mind. Was it Austin?
Austin.
Yeah. Today he mentioned, because he was like, what are you guys talking about? Or do I have to wait till it comes out? And I don't know if he actually listens, but
he does.
By that comment, I was like, oh, he listens. Yeah. That's so nice.
Yeah. I was totally trying to bait him this morning. So he's one of the members of our fraternity.
So I'm going to drop that shout out and we won't say anything unless
see if
he
does. Listens. There you go. It's a test. Thank you guys so much for staying with us, and hopefully you guys enjoyed this. There's a lot to this. I encourage you to go, if you're going to watch it, do some research. If you're not going to do research, I would suggest probably not watching it because it can be misleading. But that's up to you. I'll let you make your own decisions. With that, thank you guys so much for joining us in the adventure this week. Don't forget to follow us on all of our social media, Facebook, The Christ and Culture, YouTube, The Christ and Culture, Twitter @OnTheAdventure2. You can also, if you like what we do, support us on Patreon for as little as $5 a month or less. If you want to make a one-time donation, you can become a patron. And in return, we give you bonus content. We give stickers. We have like mugs and stuff like that. All these different things we want to be able to give you guys. We have videos. This week, we're going to be doing a live stream with the patrons where we hang out and talk to them about different stuff and how we continue this conversation outside of the podcast. If you want involved in stuff like that, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/The Christ and Culture. And don't forget to check out all this stuff at our website, thechristandculture.com. With that, thank you guys for joining us on the adventure. We'll see you next week.
Bye.